Kanto's world has always carried a feeling of quiet timelessness, a region where the first footsteps of a new trainer echo through forests, caves, and coastal routes that feel older than the entire franchise itself. When you look back at Gen 1, you're not just looking at early Pokémon, you're looking at the foundation of an entire universe, a place where small details turned into legends, where mechanics were primitive but strangely charming, and where the creatures themselves carried a kind of mysterious simplicity. Charmander, Bulbasaur, Squirtle, Pidgey, and all the others weren't just early designs. They were experiments in what the Pokémon world could be. The surprises hidden within Gen 1 continue to surface even decades later, revealing new layers of unintentional quirks, regional myths, and strange behaviors tucked inside that old Game Boy cartridge. One of the first things people notice about Kanto's early Pokémon is how deeply the region blends nature with myth. The forests are quiet and filled with bug types that feel like they belong in a forgotten era of the world, creatures that existed long before humans began documenting them. Caterpie and Weedle weren't just early route filler. Their existence hinted at how common insect Pokémon were in Kanto's ecosystem, showing how trainers grew up surrounded by small, abundant species that shaped their early interactions with the natural world. That's why so many Kanto kids became bug catchers. The region's culture leaned heavily toward children learning the basics of training by observing real wildlife first. Before anyone battled dragons or ghosts, they battled the natural creatures right outside their homes. Gen 1 Pokémon also had an aura of unpredictability that made them memorable. The early Pokédex entries were far more intense and dramatic than the modern ones, describing creatures with strange powers and behaviors that made the world feel dangerous in a way the later games softened. Take the way early entries described creatures melting, exploding, or stealing dreams. The writers weren't thinking about franchise tone yet. They were experimenting with folklore. That's why Kanto's Pokédex feels closer to a bestiary than a scientific record. Even the gentle Pokémon sometimes had unsettling quirks, and the dangerous ones sounded mythical. This gave Gen 1 an atmosphere where every encounter felt like uncovering a story that wasn't fully told. One of the most fascinating parts of Kanto's early lore is how unrefined evolutions were compared to later generations. You had lines like Magikarp into Gyarados, where the transformation was so drastic it felt like a shift in genre, and Pokemon like Slowbro, whose evolution depended on another species interacting with it. These concepts hinted that Kanto's world was interconnected, with species influencing each other's biology. Rapidash and Arcanine were designed to look like legendary creatures, even though only one of them actually was. Pidgeot had legends surrounding its incredible flight speed, suggesting that even common Pokémon could inspire awe if viewed through the right lens. Kanto treated evolution less like a predictable mechanic and more like a natural process filled with mystery. Gen 1's simplicity also made its world feel larger. There were no abilities, no natures, no breeding systems, and no weather mechanics to complicate things. Because of that, the personality of each Pokémon felt distilled right into the way it was described, instead of hidden behind mechanics. The primordial simplicity made every species feel more like an animal, unpredictable, atmospheric, and sometimes even a little wild. The glitches tied into this feeling too. The strange behavior of missing no, the fragmented cries, the duplicated items, all of it made the region feel alive in a chaotic way. It wasn't polished, but that lack of polish gave the world an organic charm nothing since has fully recreated. Even the regional design reflected this tone. Kanto's map was compact but filled with hidden connections, caves that looped under mountains, tunnels used by travelers avoiding tall grass, and forests that acted as natural borders between cities. Viridian Forest felt like a place locals genuinely avoided at night. Rock Tunnel was pitch black in a way modern caves never are. Sea routes stretched so far across open ocean that even today, players remember the feeling of drifting endlessly with nothing but tentacle encounters for company. These environments weren't just locations, they were moods, expressions of a world where humanity lived beside powerful creatures it barely understood. The gym leaders of Kanto were also more mysterious than later generations. Lieutenant Surge had a military background that was barely explained, hinting at a world where Pokemon and war were connected more closely. Sabrina's psychic powers made her feel supernatural, almost intimidating in her confidence. Koga was a literal ninja living inside a gym built around stealth and poison. Brock and Misty were young but already experts in their fields, implying a culture where becoming a gym leader wasn't just a career, it was a way of life shaped by the region's history. And then there was Giovanni, the only gym leader to ever vanish from the position entirely, leaving a void in Kanto's power structure. Team Rocket's influence over early Kanto lore can't be overstated either. They weren't just petty criminals. They operated labs, manipulated Pokemon genetics, and tried to control entire species. Their presence throughout the region made Kanto feel tense, as if danger lurked beneath the surface of an otherwise peaceful world. They weren't cartoonish yet. They were genuinely menacing, experimenting on Pokemon with little concern for the consequences. When you encountered their hideouts, you felt like you'd wandered into something you weren't supposed to see. That tension helped define the emotional tone of the whole region, making every major location feel tied to some larger history. Many of Kanto's Pokemon reflect ancient myths that the region never fully explained. Take the fossil Pokemon, Kabuto, Kabutops, Omanite, and Omastar. Their existence suggests that Kanto sits atop ancient geological sites, rich with prehistoric life. The idea that modern trainers could revive extinct species through cutting-edge technology tied ancient history to present day in a way few games attempted at the time. These fossils weren't just collectibles. They were glimpses into epochs that shaped Kanto's earliest ecosystems. Even Aerodactyl, the most aggressive of the revived fossils, felt like a reminder that Kanto's skies once belonged to something fierce and uncontrollable. Psychic types were another point of fascination. In Gen 1, they weren't just powerful, they were dominant. Alakazam, Hypno, and others were described with abilities that bordered on supernatural phenomena, blurring the line between science and mysticism. This imbalance wasn't just a gameplay quirk, it reflected Kanto's tone. Psychic powers were treated with awe and fear, elevating these Pokemon into something almost divine. The mystic energy surrounding them, combined with Sabrina's unsettling presence, made psychic types feel like they came from a different world entirely. Ghost types added to that mystery. Lavender Town, with its music and atmosphere, became the most haunting location in all of Pokemon. Ghastly, Haunter, and Gengar were depicted less as simple Pokemon and more as spiritual entities with ties to the afterlife. Their existence suggested that the borders between life and death were thinner in Kanto than in other regions. The Pokemon Tower served as a monument to that idea, a massive burial site right in the middle of town, with spirits wandering freely. Gen 1 never shied away from the emotional weight of those themes, adding depth that few children's games attempted at the time. Even the normal type Pokemon of Kanto carried hidden layers of lore. Snorlax, for example, was more than just a sleeping obstacle. It represented the natural relationship between humans and Pokemon, showing how a creature with immense strength could coexist peacefully if treated with respect. Lapras, gentle and endangered, implied ecological imbalance in Kanto, a world where humanity's expansion affected more than just cities. Kangaskhan raised questions about family structures in Pokemon species long before breeding mechanics existed. The region didn't explain these mysteries, it simply let players discover them. Electric types added yet another layer of personality to the region. Pikachu wasn't the mascot yet, but even in Gen 1 it had an undeniable charm. Jolteon's design hinted at hyper-adaptive reflexes. Electrode's self-destructive nature suggested a creature too energetic for its own good. Zapdos embodied the ferocity of a lightning storm, its mere presence reshaping weather patterns. The electric types of Kanto weren't uniform. They represented different aspects of electricity, from its unpredictability to its raw power. Fire types brought passion and intensity. Ninetales, with its fox spirit origins, felt like a creature formed straight out of folklore. Arcanine, labeled a legendary Pokémon in the Pokédex, was revered even without being part of a trio. Charmander's evolutionary line reflected a journey from vulnerability to strength, symbolizing the idea of a trainer's growth mirrored by their partner. Flareon, although simple, carried the warmth of a creature whose entire existence revolved around heart-centered energy. Water types connected Kanto to its surroundings. With so much ocean surrounding the region, it made sense that Tentacool and Tentacruel dominated sea routes, forming natural populations that acted like barriers to trainers unprepared for the open water. Lapras, Dugong, Goldeen, and Seeking all added fluid elegance to Kanto's aquatic systems. Blastoise, with its cannons, represented the industrial might of water pressure turned into raw power. These Pokemon weren't just part of the environment, they shaped how trainers navigated the region. Grass types symbolized Kanto's ancient natural beauty. Bulbasaur's line reflected an evolutionary connection between plant and animal that felt mythic. Exeggutor carried tropical lore into a region that wasn't tropical, suggesting migration patterns across continents. Victreebel hinted at carnivorous plant species hidden deep inside uncharted jungles. The grass types weren't just peaceful, they were strange and complex, creatures that existed long before cities rose across the region. Kanto's poison types were everywhere, and that was by design. The early games hinted at pollution, environmental imbalance, and interconnected ecosystems where poison adapted naturally. From Grimer and Muck forming an industrial waste to Koffing's connection to factories, poison types represented the consequences of human expansion. But they also reflected biological resilience, species that thrived where others couldn't, turning harsh conditions into new opportunities for survival. As Gen 1 Pokemon continue to evolve in fan understanding, every new generation shines a different light on them. Modern lore reframes ancient mysteries, reinterprets old designs, and deepens the emotional impact of long-forgotten stories. Yet no matter how far the franchise grows, those first 151 remain the heart of the Pokemon world, strange, powerful, mysterious, and forever iconic. Kanto's earliest era is wrapped in a soft haze of mystery, and when you sink into that world long enough, you begin to notice how the region feels older than it first appears. The beaches of Cinnabar feel like they've been waiting centuries to share their secrets. The quiet towns tucked beneath forest canopies feel like echoes of something ancient, and the Pokemon that wander those routes still carry habits shaped long before humans began recording them. Even seemingly ordinary species hold histories that reveal how deeply connected they are to the land. When people talk about Gen 1, they often focus on nostalgia, but beneath that nostalgia is a tapestry woven from strange myths, surprising biology, and tiny regional quirks that have survived across generations. Take the forests of Kanto, for instance, places where Caterpie and Weedle grew into symbols of childhood journeys, but where their evolutionary lines originally thrived long before the League existed. Their cocoons, Cocoona and Metapod, behave like living fossils. They don't attack aggressively because their ancestors survived by staying absolutely still, letting predators mistake them for fallen leaves or tree sap growths. Even the slight twitch Metapod makes before evolving into Butterfree isn't just for drama. It's a subtle, instinctual movement meant to test the rigidity of its shell. Cocoona, on the other hand, evolved venom sacs early in Kanto's prehistory as a final line of defense during its vulnerable transition. That lingering instinct is why you'll sometimes see a Cocoona's stinger fully extended even when it isn't threatened, an evolutionary echo repeating itself thousands of years later. As those forests stretch into deeper woods, the atmosphere shifts from peaceful to otherworldly. Paras and Parasect remain the strangest examples, Pokémon whose lives are defined by a fungus growing on their backs. But the Gen 1 Pokédex wasn't exaggerating when it described the mushroom slowly taking over Paris's body. Mycologists in the Pokémon world have theorized that the strain attached to Paris is an ancient variety that once grew wild across Kanto's mountains, latching onto small insect-like creatures for nutrients. Over time, the fungus found the perfect host in Paris, and the two became inseparable. Parasect, with its blank eyes and heavy, lumbering movements, feels like something out of an older, darker version of Kanto, a reminder that the region's ecology was once more brutal and untamed than it appears today. Even the friendlier Pokémon of Kanto carry stories shaped by time. Pidgey, often dismissed as simple or common, is actually one of the oldest bird species in the region. Fossil records imply that ancient Pidgey flocks once migrated across all of Kanto, Johto, and even parts of Sinnoh long before trainers ever documented them. Their remarkable sense of direction, the reason Pidgeotto and Pidgeot are so reliable in courier work, stems from a magnetic sensitivity in their feathers. When sunlight hits them at certain angles, the tiny barbs glow faintly, something only visible in untouched wilderness. It's a phenomenon rangers have used for decades to track wild migrations, a quiet secret hidden in a Pokémon many trainers learn to overlook. One of the more mysterious groups from Kanto's early ecosystem is the Abra line. Abra itself, though rarely seen awake, possesses psychic power so intense that its brain remains active even while it sleeps. Researchers attempting to measure its neural activity found waves of psychic energy radiating from it like soft pulses, almost like a heartbeat you can feel rather than hear. Kadabra's spoon, the focus of endless debates and urban legends, is actually bound to its psychic energy. If you take it away, the spoon loses shape quickly, becoming distorted metal as if softened by unseen force. Alakazam, with its dual spoons, simply amplifies this effect. What fascinates researchers even more is that wild Alakazam always carries spoons of identical shape and curvature, an impossible coincidence unless the spoons are psychically forged. It suggests a level of precision and mental discipline far beyond anything humans can replicate. The psychic mysteries stretch deeper when you consider the stories surrounding Drowsy and Hypno. Their connection to ancient tapir-like creatures is well established, but what trainers rarely realize is that modern Drowsy inherit memory fragments passed down from those ancient ancestors. When a Drowsy samples a dream, it isn't just feeding, it's comparing the dreamer's mind to remnants of ancient dreams still buried within its own DNA. Some researchers believe that when drowsy becomes unusually attached to a particular person, it's because their dreams resemble patterns stored within the species' evolutionary past. Hypno's pendulum, meanwhile, is theorized to be an evolved form of an old instinct, creating rhythmic movements to calm prey before feeding. Today, it uses those motions more like a ritual than a hunt, but the instinct predates written Kanto history by millennia. Then there are the strange mechanical Pokémon of Kanto, species whose origins blur the line between natural evolution and human influence. Magnemite and Magneton often spark theories about artificial creation, yet field studies reveal they're undeniably organic in their own way. Their bodies contain metallic compounds that respond to electromagnetic fields, allowing them to levitate with eerie precision. The odd hum they produce isn't accidental, it's actually a form of communication. Magneton clusters can synchronize their hums into harmonic frequencies, causing entire rooms to vibrate faintly. Power plants in Kanto learned long ago to build energy grids around these Pokémon, not because they're a threat, but because their presence stabilizes electrical output in ways even human engineers struggle to understand. Voltorb and Electrode, on the other hand, are mysteries tied directly to the first Pokeballs ever produced in Kanto. Their spherical shapes resemble early apricorn-based designs much more than modern ones, leading historians to believe their species first appeared when exposure to raw energy near experimental machinery caused something inorganic to become alive. Electrode's spontaneous explosions are not acts of aggression. They're a pressure release mechanism that evolved rapidly during this strange transition into life. Their ability to convert absorbed electricity into explosive force reflects a survival instinct. When cornered, they simply reset themselves. It's a strange kind of rebirth that only a region with Kanto's unpredictable past could produce. Kanto's waters add their own layers of lore, especially around species like Tentacool and Tentacruel. Their translucent bodies allow sunlight to refract in eerie patterns, giving them an appearance that early sailors mistook for spirits. Tentacruel, with its massive central orb and floating tendrils, was once considered a sea guardian by island communities near Fuchsia. Ancient carvings depict it rising from the ocean depths, glowing softly as it guided fishermen through storms, using the bioluminescent patterns in its tentacles. Modern science attributes this glow to chemical processes within its body, but the stories remain reminders of how deeply Kanto's culture is tied to its Pokémon. The deserts and rocky paths of Kanto also house ancient bloodlines. Sandshrew and Sandslash evolved not from typical mammals, but from a lineage of burrowing creatures adapted to volcanic soil. Their tough scales originally formed from minerals absorbed underground, and even today, wild Sandslash have subtle color variations depending on the earth they dig through. Geodude, Graveler, and Golem, likewise, aren't rock creatures in the traditional sense. They're living organisms with a circulatory system that channels trace metal deposits, giving their bodies density and hardness. When Golem sheds its outer shell, something that happens only once every few decades, the cast-off husk becomes so durable that early civilizations used them as building materials for temples. One of the most mysterious evolutionary paths in Kanto belongs to Cubone and Marowak, whose lore intertwines with loss, memory, and resilience. Cubone's skull helmet remains one of the most debated pieces of Gen 1 lore, but what's clear from modern research is that the bone gradually melds to its head as it matures, forming a natural extension rather than an external object. Marowak's club, meanwhile, is an evolutionary adaptation shaped by necessity, When early Cubone survived only by defending themselves against predators in Kanto's harsher climates, they learned to harden fallen bones in fire pits created by volcanic eruptions near Cinnabar. Over thousands of years, this behavior became instinctual. Today, every Marowak's club carries subtle markings that can be traced back to the region it came from, a kind of ancestral signature written in bone. The urban legends surrounding ghost types in Kanto have even deeper roots. Ghastly is not just gas, it's a mixture of spirit energy and airborne toxins from old, abandoned districts of the region. Haunter's floating hands are condensed spectral force, capable of phasing through matter because their composition is closer to emotion than physical substance. And Gengar's grin, often associated with mischief, has a far older origin. In ancient Kanto, shadows behaving independently were considered signs of restless spirits. Gengar's ability to merge with shadows made it the subject of nighttime myths that described figures laughing from the floorboards. Even though modern trainers know better, those stories persist because of how convincingly Gengar can mimic a person's silhouette in total darkness, an eerie but strangely playful remnant of folklore woven into real biology. Even Lapras, one of Kanto's gentlest Pokémon, carries ancient weight. Its species once traveled in massive migratory pods across the oceans, singing calls that could be heard miles away. When habitat loss reduced their numbers, they adapted by remaining near human settlements where protection was stronger. Their complex songs, recorded in modern labs, contain repeating melodic patterns that some believe are echoes of those vast migrations, a kind of ancestral memory preserved in sound. That's why standing near a Lapras at night feels oddly melancholy. You're hearing a voice shaped by centuries of wandering, now confined to smaller waters. Gen 1 lore is full of these quiet undercurrents, stories hidden beneath familiar shapes. Diglett and Dugtrio, for example, maintain entire underground systems across Kanto, shaping soil quality more than any human-made agriculture ever has. Their tunnels are organized in intricate patterns, avoiding tree roots and water veins as if guided by intuition. Some scientists insist they communicate through subtle tremors, creating vibrations that carry messages faster than sound through Earth. The idea that Diglett pop up randomly is a misunderstanding. They pop up exactly where they intend to, guided by a communication network more efficient than technology. Even the oddities of the Safari Zone have roots in ancient systems. Chansey didn't become rare because the species was small. They became rare because their nurturing behavior kept them constantly moving, caring for wounded Pokémon across massive territories. Kangaskhan, with its maternal instincts, formed matriarchal groups long before humans documented them. Tauros herds shaped the grassland ecology through migration patterns that once stretched across half the region. Every species, no matter how small or strange, contributes to a world older and more interconnected than most trainers ever stop to consider. Kanto isn't just a region, it's a living archive. Every Pokémon carries pieces of a long, slow evolution shaped by volcanic activity, dense forests, ancient ruins, and early human settlements. And when you look closely enough, every ordinary creature becomes extraordinary, a thread woven into a much larger tapestry of mystery. Gen 1's world is quieter, simpler, and more grounded than later regions, but that simplicity hides enormous depth. The Pokémon aren't just species, they're echoes of ancient stories, shaped by time, environment, and traditions that existed long before anyone began calling the land Kanto. The charm of Gen 1 isn't just nostalgia, it's that feeling of walking through a world that has always been alive, always been mysterious, and always been waiting for someone patient enough to listen. There is something deeply soothing about returning to the oldest corners of the Pokemon world, places where the earliest myths and mechanics were still forming, and every creature felt like a small mystery waiting to be uncovered. In Kanto, so much of that early mystery came from how unpredictable the world seemed. Pokemon behaved differently, moved differently, and lived with a raw wildness that later generations would refine. This is why many fans still describe Gen 1 as having an atmosphere that was never replicated, an almost foggy blend of urban legend, glitchy unpredictability, and quiet isolation that created a feeling unique to that era. And hidden within that world are countless small details, some subtle, some strange, some almost forgotten, that shaped the very foundation of Pokemon lore. For example, one of the earliest curiosities lies in how Kanto's environment was designed. Many people don't realize that the region was intentionally built with narrow routes and long stretches of silence to mirror the feeling of being alone on an adventure. Places like Route 8 or Route 10 feel wide and empty, not because of technical limitations, but because the developers wanted players to experience anticipation before encountering each new Pokemon. The emptiness was deliberate. Even Pokemon centers were spaced farther apart in some places, encouraging players to feel the thrill and tension of pushing just a little farther into the unknown. This design philosophy helped define Kanto's atmosphere, and is one reason exploring it still feels nostalgic even decades later. One of the oddest bits of lore from early Kanto relates to Mr. Mime, whose existence raised countless questions even in 1996. The idea that a human-like Pokemon performs as part of household entertainment was strange enough, but the early games also implied a deeper connection between Pokemon and human culture. Mr. Mime was capable of replacing household labor, protecting families with invisible walls, and even bonding like a family member. Some fans theorized that Mr. Mime was originally intended to blur the line between Pokemon and humans. After all, its design is more humanoid than most, and its behavior mirrors trained performers. Whether intentional or not, Mr. Mime remains a reminder that Gen 1 wasn't afraid to explore odd, surreal ideas that later generations softened. Another Gen 1 creature that carried unexpected depth was Machamp, whose Dex entries described it as having enough power to move mountains or deliver punches faster than the eye can see. These exaggerated descriptions became part of Pokemon's charm, but many players didn't notice that Machamp's power was also connected to Kanto's geography. Its species was commonly associated with construction sites around Vermilion and Saffron City, hinting at a world where humans relied on Pokemon not just for battles but for heavy labor. This wasn't stated outright, but implied through small details, NPC dialogue, overworld sprites, and scattered references. Early Kanto did world building quietly, letting players piece things together from context rather than explanation. One of the most atmospheric locations in Gen 1 was the Seafoam Islands, which carried an unusual mixture of peaceful and eerie energy. The soft blue palette, the subtle cave ambience, and the isolated flow of water made the entire area feel like a forgotten place untouched by time. Legends of Articuno hiding deep within its frozen heart gave the location mythical weight, but even without encountering the legendary bird, the caves felt sacred. They were ancient, untouched, cool, and quiet, the kind of place where players instinctively walked slower. Kanto's caves were often intimidating, but Seafoam was different. It felt like a sanctuary, a natural cathedral of ice where silence was its own kind of lore. Kanto was also filled with Pokemon whose early designs held deeper implications that players rarely noticed. Paris and Parasect are prime examples, creatures slowly overtaken by parasitic mushrooms. In later generations, this idea became more explicit, but even in Gen 1, the concept was far darker than anything else in the Pokédex. The lore described Parasect as being fully controlled by the fungus, its original self nearly gone. This was the first moment Pokémon introduced a truly unsettling idea that not all creatures lived in harmony with their biology. Some were victims of natural forces beyond their control. Yet even in this eerie premise, the world presented it calmly, as though it were simply another piece of nature's balance. Then there was Cloyster, a Pokémon whose design hinted at defensive perfection. Its sharp shell, its layered armor, and the way its interior remained hidden created an aura of mystery. Some fans interpreted its grin as unsettling, while others saw it as playful. But the most interesting detail lies in early Pokédex entries describing its shell as impossible to break. The theme of unbreakable defenses appears nowhere else in Gen 1 with this level of emphasis, which makes Cloyster stand out as a kind of natural fortress among sea Pokémon. Even today, players still debate whether its shell protects something fragile or hides something powerful. Another often overlooked part of early Kanto lore was the concept of Pokémon migrations. Before modern games introduced seasons or region-specific changes, Kanto quietly hinted that some Pokémon were rarer during certain times or places because they traveled in patterns. The Safari Zone was the most obvious example, hosting species that didn't appear anywhere else in the region. But even outside it, dialogue suggested that Pokémon like Chansey, Tauros, and Kangaskhan were uncommon in the wild because their habitats were far from human settlements. The idea of regional rarity became foundational to future games, but it was already present in Gen 1, just never explained directly. Some of Gen 1's strangest lore surrounds Hypno, whose Pokédex entries became famous for their unsettling tone. They described it as hypnotizing children, pulling people into dreams, and even feeding off psychic energy. But beneath the creepiness lies fascinating symbolism. Hypno represented humanity's oldest fears about dreams: fear of losing oneself, fear of being controlled, fear of the unknown inside one's mind. Kanto's world often felt grounded in reality, but creatures like Hypno added surreal psychological shadows that hinted at deeper themes. It was a reminder that the peaceful world of Pokémon wasn't without its eerie corners, and that even gentle environments could hide unsettling mysteries. Another Pokémon that carried subtle narrative weight was Lapras. In Gen 1, it wasn't simply a water-type Pokémon. It was described as nearly extinct, hunted by humans, and desperately in need of protection. These notes marked one of the first times the series acknowledged human impact on Pokémon populations. Lapras became a symbol of harmony, a creature that loved carrying people across the sea and communicated through song. Its gentle nature contrasted sharply with its endangered status, and that contrast created emotional resonance. Players felt a responsibility toward it, and that feeling endured across generations. Even Kanto's ghost Pokémon carried understated depth. Ghastly, Haunter, and Gengar weren't just spooky creatures, they represented the idea of spirits interacting with the physical world. Lavender Town amplified this theme, surrounding players with an unforgettable atmosphere of grief, memory, and unresolved history. But one of the most intriguing details in early lore is that Gengar was once rumored to be the shadow of another Pokémon entirely. Whether intended or not, that rumor became part of Kanto's mythology, blending fact and fan interpretation in a way Gen 1 did uniquely well. The line between canon and imagination blurred, creating a playful uncertainty that still defines Kanto's storytelling. Even simple creatures like Butterfree carried hidden lore in the first generation. Its migratory behavior, its gentle personality, and the emotional weight of releasing one during the anime all helped shape how players viewed early Pokemon not as tools for battle, but as living beings with their own instincts and desires. This emotional layer contributed vastly to why Kanto felt alive, whether intentional or accidental. Gen 1 consistently made players care not just about winning battles, but about understanding the creatures they traveled with. Another fascinating detail lies in Kanto's early depiction of scientific experimentation. The world included laboratories, fossil resurrection machines, psychic research centers, and genetic engineering facilities. Cinnabar Island alone held enough story threads to fill an entire game: failed experiments, volcanic activity, and ancient fossils all merging into a single island that felt both modern and prehistoric. This blending of science and mystery created one of Kanto's strongest tonal contrasts. It was a region steeped in tradition yet obsessed with discovery, creating a narrative tension that shaped Pokemon lore for decades. Gen 1 also introduced some of the most iconic environmental hazards in early Pokemon history. Caves were dim and maze-like, forests thick and disorienting, waters deep and unpredictable. The idea that the world wasn't always safe made every step meaningful. Victory Road felt like a true test of endurance. Mount Moon felt ancient and sacred. Rock Tunnel felt oppressive and claustrophobic without flash. These atmospheric spaces shaped the emotional texture of Kanto, making it feel like a place where adventure wasn't just about collecting Pokemon, it was about surviving the journey. And as players moved across the region, they unknowingly interacted with one of Gen 1's most iconic pieces of myth, the ancient war hinted at through Latent. Surge's dialogue. One small line about how Surge used electric Pokemon to save his life in a war sparked decades of speculation about Kanto's past. It was vague, understated, and never explained again. But that single comment gave the entire region a hidden layer of history. Suddenly, abandoned buildings, small towns, and sparsely populated areas looked different. They felt like scars of a world slowly rebuilding. Kanto's stories were rarely spelled out. They were implied, whispered, left lingering at the edges of dialogue and environment. That's what makes its lore so powerful, even today. It's a place where the gaps between the facts are just as compelling as the facts themselves. A region built on quiet mysteries, subtle hints, and the unspoken knowledge that the world is bigger than what players can see. The world of Kanto has always carried a feeling of quiet depth beneath its simple roots and forests, as if every patch of tall grass and every shadowed corner contains a story that predates the journey of any trainer passing through. Even the most ordinary Pokemon of the region carry histories older than the Pokédex itself, little echoes of a world that existed long before trainers began capturing and recording life. When you look closely enough at the creatures that inhabit the original 150, you begin to see patterns, small hints that the region's ecosystem was shaped by forces both natural and mysterious. Take the common Pidgey, for example. It's so unassuming that most players barely register it beyond the early battles, but it's one of the most behaviorally realistic Pokemon in Kanto. Its docile nature, its preference for avoiding conflict, and its strong homing instincts mirror certain real-world species so closely that biologists in the Pokemon world often use Pidgey as a teaching model for avian behavior. Yet for all its normalcy, it also has a fascinating relationship with ancient Kanto wind patterns, likely adapting its lightweight body over centuries of living near coastal routes and long plains where sudden gusts can shift terrain. Even the simplest Pokemon carries the imprint of its environment. Then there's Weedle, another early root creature that players often rush past. In the lore, however, Weedle is an important ecological marker. Its horn secretes a mildly toxic compound that reflects the chemical makeup of the plants it feeds on, meaning that in regions with particularly bitter or medicinal herbs, Weedle's poison becomes stronger. Rangers in Viridian Forest can actually tell which parts of the woods have changed in plant life by studying Weedle's toxin levels. It's a subtle detail, but one that shows how deeply the Pokémon and the environment are connected, even in places players sprint through without much thought. Kanto's water Pokémon continue that trend of hidden complexity. Goldeen, a Pokémon often overshadowed by more dramatic swimmers, has always carried a quiet mystique. Its horn isn't just a weapon. Early Pokédex notes imply it may act as a sensory organ, helping Goldeen detect underwater vibrations through subtle shifts in pressure. That gentle, elegant swim pattern it performs, it isn't just for show. Those looping movements reduce turbulence, allowing Goldeen to glide without disturbing sediment on riverbeds. In a region like Kanto, where water clarity affects both wild Pokémon behavior and fishing yield, Goldeen plays a pivotal ecological role simply by swimming gracefully. Even Meowth, a Pokémon best known for its association with Team Rocket and its mischievous antics, has lore that stretches deeper than many realize. The coin on its forehead isn't actually a literal coin. It's a keratinized plate that formed through selective adaptation in urban environments. Its shine attracts prey in moonlight, making Meowth one of the earliest Pokémon to develop hunting strategies around artificial lighting from human towns. Over time, those city-dwelling Meowth became cleverer and more bold, eventually producing the far more cunning personality often associated with the species today. What looks like a comedic mascot has roots in real environmental evolution. Kanto's ghost Pokémon are filled with small mysteries too. Ghastly's body, for example, is described as being made mostly of gaseous compounds that can expand or contract depending on air quality. That means older buildings, like the Pokémon Tower in Lavender Town, create the perfect habitat. Drafty halls and fluctuating temperatures give Ghastly its floating, shifting presence. But perhaps the more intriguing idea is that Ghastly's gas isn't inherently dangerous. It only becomes harmful when the Pokémon becomes stressed or threatened. Trainers who bond with Ghastly often notice the fog around it feels warmer and smoother, almost comforting. It's a far cry from the frightening presence many expect from something classified as a ghost. Cubone remains one of the most emotionally complicated Pokémon of Kanto. While its famous lore is widely known, newer research suggests Cubone's behavior is shaped entirely by early attachment experiences. That's why two Cubone raised together often form unbreakable bonds, standing protectively over each other in the wild. Its habit of looking at the moon, something noted even in the earliest Pokédex entries, may be tied to early imprinting, a way of soothing its grief by looking at the brightest object in its sky, almost as if searching for comfort. This tiny behavioral detail has made Cubone one of the most human of the Kanto species, capable of deep emotion and memory. Even the bug types, thought to be the simplest organisms in Kanto, show remarkable complexity. Venonat's glowing eyes, for example, act like twin radars, picking up faint traces of heat at night. Some researchers speculate Venonat's entire body structure evolved to hunt creatures like Paris, using heat detection to locate them under logs and leaves. These details explain why Venonat appears so suddenly and unpredictably. It's searching not with sight, but with atmospheric awareness. And then there's Butterfree, a Pokémon that doesn't just migrate instinctively, but remembers specific wind currents through generational memory. That means every Butterfree inherits flight paths from the ones that came before, turning their migrations into living maps of the region's history. The same depth applies to Pokémon that seem chaotic at first glance. Psyduck has long been portrayed as confused, distracted, and overwhelmed, but the lore behind its headaches is surprisingly profound. Rather than being a flaw, the pain Psyduck experiences is actually a biological limit of an exceptionally powerful psychic reservoir. Its brain constantly suppresses psychic output to protect itself. When that suppression breaks, even momentarily, the resulting burst of energy is uncontrolled but undeniably impressive. Psyduck is essentially a creature holding back extraordinary potential, a silent, walking paradox of power disguised as fragility. Fearow, often overshadowed by Pidgeot, carries a kind of primal ancient lore. Its long beak and strong neck are adaptations that date back centuries, remnants of a predatory lineage far older than most modern Kanto birds. Some historical texts describe sightings of enormous, shadowy birds over ancient settlements long before Pokeballs were invented. Many believe Fearow is a descendant of that ancient species, maintaining traits optimized for soaring over open plains for hours at a time without rest. The wingspan, smaller than its predecessor, suggests Kanto's modern environment shaped Fearow into something more manageable, yet still formidable. On the opposite end of the power spectrum lies Ditto, one of the strangest Pokemon in existence. While players often celebrate its ability to breed with nearly anything or transform into any creature, its lore hints at a deeper mystery. Its amorphous body composition is nearly identical to that of Mew, a detail noted in early developer interviews and in-game scientific notes. That doesn't mean Ditto is a failed clone or a leftover experiment. Instead, the theory suggests Ditto may be a naturally occurring biological parallel to genetic potential. It represents possibility, a creature that could become anything but chooses simplicity to conserve energy. Ditto exists outside normal evolutionary logic, making it one of the quietest but most mysterious beings in Kanto. The fossils of Kanto bring their own quiet histories. Kabuto, often revived in the lab, was believed extinct until researchers realized its species survived in isolated pockets of deep-sea caverns. That means the ancient Kabuto we revive aren't reinventions. They're long-lost cousins of living colonies that have adapted to darkness. Omanite, with its spiral shell, shows a similar resilience. The shell pattern resembles the golden ratio, suggesting that its form wasn't random, but mathematically optimized for deep-sea pressure. These fossils aren't merely remnants of the past. They're windows into the mathematical and biological precision that shaped Pokémon long before humans interacted with them. Even the region's normal-type Pokémon hold fascinating stories. Rattata, often dismissed as a nuisance, has one of the fastest breeding cycles of any species in Kanto, which has allowed it to thrive even in the harshest environments. The Alolan variant didn't appear randomly. It emerged when Rattata populations migrated and adapted under the pressure of changing predators. This makes Rattata one of the most resilient examples of natural selection in the entire series, demonstrating how quickly Pokémon genetics respond to environmental stress. And we can't overlook the eerie mysteries surrounding Hypno. While famous for its hypnotic abilities, more interesting is its connection to sleep science within the Pokémon world. Researchers studying its pendulum found microscopic energy emissions that match certain wavelengths associated with deep REM sleep. That implies Hypno doesn't just hypnotize, it guides brainwaves into specific patterns. Its interest in inducing sleep may be instinctual, a biological drive rather than malice. While its lore often feels unsettling, the truth behind Hypno's behavior may be more complex, tied to natural sleep cycles rather than predatory intent. The original 150 hide endless stories beneath their simple disguises. Kanto's world is filled with Pokémon, whose characteristics tie directly into the land they inhabit. Forests shaped by wind patterns, caves formed by ancient movements of the earth, and waters influenced by species that migrated long before humans settled the region. These details weave a world that feels alive, ancient, and interconnected. The Pokemon of Kanto are more than creatures encountered on a route. They are living records of evolution, history, emotion, and mystery, each carrying a piece of the region's soul. Even now, decades after these creatures were first introduced, they continue to inspire discovery. Trainers new and old return to the region with fresh curiosity, realizing that even the most common Pokemon has layers waiting to be uncovered. Kanto's lore never truly stops expanding. It grows quietly with every generation, every observation, and every trainer who looks at a familiar Pokemon and wonders what untold story still lies beneath the surface. The world of Kanto continues to unfold with quiet depth the longer you sit with its history, as if every familiar corner still holds layers waiting to be uncovered. Even the most iconic locations, the ones players have visited countless times, still feel like they carry secrets whispered between the pixels of the old games. Places like Viridian Forest or the outskirts of Route 2 seem simple on the surface, but behind the stillness lies the earliest architecture of the Pokemon world storytelling, crafted in small fragments that reveal themselves through atmosphere rather than explanation. Gen 1 didn't need elaborate cutscenes to convey mystery. The silence of its world was enough. Those long stretches of trees, where the music softened into a gentle hum, felt like the first introduction to what exploring the Pokemon universe truly meant. Immersion through quiet steps. Even the Pokemon found there carry that same quiet legacy. The early root bug types, for example, were never meant to be mere stepping stones. They represent something often overlooked, the first demonstration that not every Pokemon is designed for power, and not every companion has to stay forever. They represent growth, temporary allies who teach players how the journey evolved. Trainers who encountered Kakuna or Metapod for the first time experienced something subtle, the lesson that some Pokemon are about patience rather than immediate strength. Their hardened shells and limited movesets quietly encouraged players to think more deeply about how evolution works, how strategy shifts with each stage. And when they finally evolved into Beedrill or Butterfree, that brief burst of triumph always felt earned in a way early game victories rarely do. Butterfree in particular holds a special place in Kanto's emotional landscape. Its soft design, delicate wings, and gentle nature made it one of the first Pokemon many trainers genuinely cared about. The moment it learned, Confusion gave players their first taste of type strategy beyond physical attacks. And although its stats didn't keep up with late-game threats, its emotional importance became legendary through the anime's iconic Bye Bye Butterfree moment, a scene that still resonates decades later. That episode revealed something Gen 1 had been hinting at all along, that Pokemon isn't just a battle system. It's a story about companionship, change, and letting go. Even Pokemon that seemed abrasive on the surface carried deeper meaning. Take Ekans, for example. The lore, hidden in its early Pokédex entries, described how it swallows eggs whole, blending real-world instincts with fantasy in a way that gave Kanto creatures a primal feel. Arbok's patterns were said to differ depending on region, a line that, even back then, planted the earliest idea of regional variation long before official regional forms existed. These details often went unnoticed by casual players, but they reveal how Gen 1 quietly built the foundation for almost every lore concept that would later define the franchise. Then you have the normal type Pokemon, often dismissed as simple. Yet these creatures form the backbone of Kanto's wildlife. Rattata and Raticate, despite their reputation as early nuisances, introduced the idea of territorial aggression in the Pokemon world. Their Pokédex notes mentioned how fiercely they protected their nests, mirroring real-world rodent behavior. Pidgey, tranquil and unthreatening, taught the opposite lesson, that not all wild encounters are battles waiting to happen. Its docile nature created a sense of natural calm across Kanto's landscape. Pidgeot, its final evolution, became one of the region's first examples of elegance, a surprisingly majestic Pokemon for something that began so quietly on Route 1. Kanto's interconnectedness becomes even more apparent when you look at Pokemon like Spearow and Fearow. Their design wasn't just to contrast Pidgey, but to demonstrate danger early on. The anime amplified this idea with the memorable first episode Swarm attack, painting Spearow as a reminder that the wild could be harsh. In the games, the unsettling cry files and aggressive encounter rates hinted that not every creature is meant to be approached with friendliness. Kanto always balanced its softness with sharpness, a world welcoming enough for beginners, yet mysterious enough to keep them cautious. Mount Moon remains one of the strongest early examples of that duality. Its dark tunnels, lit only by faint flickers of the blue tiles, created the first true sense of dungeon exploration in the series. Here, players encountered Clefairy, whose association with the Moonstone hinted at extraterrestrial origins long before the franchise explored cosmic lore. Early concept art suggested Clefairy was once intended to be the franchise mascot instead of Pikachu, a thought that changes how people view its place in Kanto's ecosystem. The fact that Clefairy's evolutionary line is tied directly to moonlight and evolution stones also set the foundation for the game's earliest ideas about alternate evolution methods, a design principle that would explode into complexity decades later. The fossil Pokemon of Kanto add another layer of mythic history, tying ancient extinction and revival to modern technology. The old amber fragments allow players to resurrect Aerodactyl, a creature described in its Pokédex as a fearsome predator that once ruled the skies, its screech causing terror among ancient Pokemon. Kabuto and Omanite, revived from Dome and Helix fossils, introduce ideas of evolution and survival, with Kabuto said to occasionally be found alive in secluded areas, a quiet implication that not everything from the past has faded away. These early hints at ancient Pokemon civilizations would eventually grow into entire eras of lore, but their origins lie in the simple act of reviving fossils in Pewter City's lab. Lavender Town, of course, remains one of the most iconic and misunderstood locations in gaming history. Its quiet music, composed of eerie minor tones, creates a lasting impression that transcended the technical limitations of the cartridge. The Pokemon Tower introduced concepts of death, mourning, and spiritual energy, making it one of the boldest narrative decisions in the series. Ghost-type Pokemon, previously just strange silhouettes, became fully realized entities tied to emotion and loss. Ghastly, Haunter, and Gengar gained lore depth from this location alone, illustrating how Gen 1's world-building used atmosphere instead of explanations. The Marowak Ghost, one of the first true story events in the franchise, remains a foundational moment for Pokemon narrative structure. Saffron City serves as the opposite extreme, a bustling metropolis under corporate tension. The Silph Invasion's storyline gave Team Rocket their most substantial presence, hinting at criminal structures that extended far beyond petty theft. Even today, the Silph building stands as a symbol of early Pokemon world politics. Megacorporations, scientific innovation, and moral ambiguity. Psychic-type Pokémon reach their peak in this region, with Sabrina's gym reflecting psychic discipline, emotional control, and an unsettling silence. The difficulty spike her team introduced in the original red and blue versions became a formative challenge for early players, especially before the dark type existed to balance psychic dominance. Seafoam Islands, often overshadowed by other late-game locations, hide one of Kanto's most atmospheric encounters. The whirling currents and icy corridors create a feeling of environmental hostility not present elsewhere. Even without flashy visuals, the original games conveyed cold through sound design. The echoing cave audio subtly shifting as players approached the chamber where Articuno waited. That quiet room, with the legendary bird perched against a backdrop of ancient ice, felt like the first moment players encountered something truly regal in the wild. There are no hints, no dialogue, no cinematic, just silence and presence, which makes the encounter unforgettable. Victory Road, another challenging location, embodies the culmination of Kanto's journey. The rock and ground types that roam its halls serve not just as obstacles, but as reminders of raw physicality. Machoke and Machamp demonstrate muscular design philosophies that weren't afraid to push into more humanoid silhouettes. The labyrinth itself encourages patience and precision, teaching players how to navigate physical puzzles in tandem with battle endurance. When the exit finally reveals the Indigo Plateau, the contrast between the dark cave and the open sky feels almost symbolic, emerging from hardship into mastery. Even the Pokémon League champions of Kanto carry understated but powerful thematic roles. Lorelei represents discipline and calm strategy. Bruno embodies perseverance and brute strength. Agatha symbolizes the wisdom of age and the mysteries of the occult. Lance represents the romantic ideal of dragons as symbols of ancient power. And then, after all that, comes the final twist, your rival, standing where you hope to stand, reminding players that mastery is a race without warning. That unexpected battle became one of the most defining moments in the franchise, setting the standard for future champions and rivalries alike. Kanto's legacy is woven not just through its Pokémon or locations, but through the tone it created. Minimalist, mysterious, and quietly compelling. Every cave hums with depth, every route holds memories, and every building hints at deeper societal structure. Gen 1 wasn't just the start of a series, it was the blueprint for an entire universe, constructed with such restraint that the gaps became part of the atmosphere. That's why returning to Kanto never feels repetitive. Its silence is timeless, and its stories continue to unfold each time the player revisits it with new eyes. And somewhere within that world, beneath the soft glow of pixelated moonlight, a young trainer still walks through the tall grass for the first time, unaware of the legends waiting to emerge from the simplest patches of green. That's the true magic of Kanto, its ability to make the familiar feel mythic, the small feel meaningful, and the quiet feel endless. The deeper you drift into the world of Kanto, the more it begins to feel like a place made of memory rather than geography, a region shaped not just by towns and routes, but by the strange and unforgettable personalities of the Pokémon who first defined what that world could be. Even after decades, the first generation still carries a kind of nostalgic gravity. Everything about it, the sprites, the myths, the glitches, the strange behavior of ancient creatures lingering in forests or caves, feels like a dream you keep returning to. And the deeper you explore those memories, the more secrets seem to linger just beneath the surface of the familiar. Take Kangaskhan, for example, one of the most quietly mysterious Pokémon in the entire franchise. Even in the early days, players notice something odd. The baby in its pouch never evolves, never leaves, never has a Pokédex entry of its own. The game treats the mother and child as a single entity, almost as if they're bound together by fate rather than biology. Some believe Kangaskhan represents a species on the brink of an evolutionary split, with the child destined to become something entirely different one day. Others think it's a relic of an incomplete idea left intentionally vague, a reminder that Kanto's world is less a polished ecosystem and more a rough draft of a myth still being written. That uncertainty is part of why the species has remained so beloved. It stands at the crossroads of what we know and what we can only imagine. Another Gen 1 oddity that continues to fascinate fans is the behavior of Ditto. Its ability to transform into any Pokémon has always carried an underlying sense of melancholy. It never shows its true face because it may not truly have one. When you watch Ditto mimic another creature, it's as if it's borrowing identity rather than copying form. And the fact that its failed transformations always retain the same simple face only deepens the mystery, as though Ditto's true nature is something soft, blank, and unfinished. Some early in-game lore suggested that Ditto may have been born from failed genetic experiments, wandering the world as leftover organic clay from a forgotten lab. Whether or not that's true, Ditto embodies the strange charm of early Pokémon design, creatures that feel both whimsical and unsettling, born from the imagination of a world that was still discovering itself. Then there's Pinsir, a Pokémon whose intimidating appearance masks surprisingly gentle behavior in nature. Despite its massive horns and fierce grip, Pinsir isn't aggressive without reason. In wild environments, it lives peacefully among trees and vines, using its strength not to harm, but to survive in dense forests. Many trainers are surprised to discover that Pinsir enjoys mild climates and often gathers with others of its kind during warm nights. These social displays give the species an almost ceremonial quality, the clicking of horns against bark, creating rhythmic sounds that echo through the quiet wilds of Kanto. It's a reminder that appearances rarely tell the full story. Even some of the most fearsome creatures hide unexpectedly gentle hearts. Meanwhile, Exeggutor remains one of the strangest examples of early Pokémon biology. Described as a group of eggs, yet demonstrably plant-like, the species' canonical classification continues to confuse and amuse fans. The idea that 6 individual seeds somehow share a psychic link strong enough to move and battle as one is both charming and bizarre, and the fact that Execute can evolve into Exeggutor, a towering walking palm tree, only deepens the oddity. This evolution feels less like growth and more like metamorphosis, as if the seeds were always destined to become a unified organism, but needed time to find the right environment. Kanto lore hints that Exeggutor is ancient, possibly predating the region's forests altogether. That idea, subtle as it is, adds a layer of prehistoric wonder to a species often dismissed for its cartoonish appearance. Even the simplest Pokémon from Gen 1 carry hidden depth. Take Poliwag, a small, round creature whose spiral pattern isn't just a design, but a window into its biology. The swirl on its stomach is actually its intestines, visible through its thin skin, a detail that quietly sets it apart as one of the few Pokémon whose design reflects biological transparency. The more you look at it, the more Poliwag feels like a creature caught between worlds, part tadpole, part infant, part mystery. Its transition into Poliwhirl, and eventually Poliwrath, reflects the region's fascination with slow, natural evolution shaped by water and willpower. The fact that its swirl reverses direction when it evolves into Poliwhirl is one of those small Gen 1 quirks that fans still point out decades later, a reminder that early Pokémon design contained countless quiet details that rewarded close observation. On the opposite end of the spectrum stands Arcanine, a Pokémon whose majesty seems almost out of place among the simpler creatures of early Kanto. It's labeled a legendary Pokémon in the Pokédex, not because it's a true legendary, but because ancient texts admired it as one. Early in the franchise's creation, Arcanine was nearly placed alongside the actual legendary birds, its design steeped in mythological imagery drawn from Eastern guardian lions. Even though it ultimately became a standard species rather than a mythic one, that aura never faded. Trainers who raise Arcanine often describe feeling as though they're partnering with a creature of noble spirit, fiercely loyal, endlessly brave, and dignified in every movement. Its roar echoes across plains like rolling thunder, a sound both powerful and comforting. Gen 1 is full of these unspoken wonders. Even common Pokemon like Pidgeot carry whispers of myth, its incredible flight speed described as fast enough to circle the globe in a day, a detail that transforms an ordinary regional bird into something almost celestial. In the games, Pidgeot serves as a symbol of journey and return, the windborne guide of new trainers who are just starting to understand the vast world waiting beyond their hometown. Pidgeot's association with endurance and wisdom gives it a sense of narrative weight far beyond its role as an early game companion. It represents the sky's quiet promise that no matter how far you travel, the wind will always bring you home. And lurking beneath all these wonders is the quiet strangeness that defined early Kanto, the feeling that certain areas held secrets no one had fully uncovered. The Pokemon Tower in Lavender Town remains one of the most atmospheric locations in the entire series, not because of its ghosts, but because of its silence. The music, soft and mournful, makes the tower feel less like a haunted place and more like a monument to memories. The spirits inside are not malicious. They are lonely, wandering through a place where time feels suspended. Players who climb the tower for the first time often recall feeling unexpectedly moved. The moment when the restless spirit finally finds peace remains one of the most emotionally understated scenes in early gaming history. Even beyond its physical spaces, Kanto holds mysteries hidden within its data. The Missing No phenomenon, a glitch Pokemon that seemed to blur the lines between game and myth, left an impression on an entire generation. It wasn't just the strange sprite or the way it distorted item counts. It was the idea that something existed inside the game that wasn't supposed to. Something undefined, unclassified, yet undeniably there. Missing No became a symbol of the unknown boundaries of early game design, a reminder that the digital world of Pokemon was alive in ways no one fully understood. To this day, it remains one of the most legendary, not a Pokemon creatures ever discovered, living on as an urban legend woven into Kanto's digital fabric. The beauty of Gen 1 lore is how seamlessly it blends the natural with the uncanny, the scientific with the supernatural. It's a world where creatures like Slowpoke can inadvertently create economic booms with their tails, where Psyduck's headaches hold psychic potential beyond comprehension, and where unassuming Pokemon like Rhyhorn carry the ancestral power of ancient beasts. Everything feels steeped in charm, wonder, and the gentle strangeness of a universe just beginning to define itself. And as you drift deeper into these memories of Kanto, it becomes clear why this region remains so beloved. It isn't the complexity that draws people in, it's the simplicity, the quiet mysteries, the feeling that every cave, forest, and coastline might hide a secret waiting to be discovered. Every Pokemon, no matter how humble, carries a story. Every piece of lore feels like a thread in a tapestry woven by time and imagination. And somewhere, In that timeless world of pixelated forests and moonlit routes, the legends of Kanto continue to breathe softly, waiting for the next curious traveler to stumble upon their stories. There's something endlessly comforting about returning to the earliest era of Pokemon, because every creature from that first generation feels like a cornerstone of the world itself, the foundation upon which everything else was built. By the time someone reaches this deep into the world of Kanto lore, there's a sense that every fact connects to something older, something primordial, something that's been there since the very beginning. Even the most familiar Pokemon reveal new details when you look closely enough, because the first generation was crafted with a kind of experimental wonder that can still be felt decades later. It's why revisiting these old creatures never loses its charm. Kanto wasn't just a region, it was the blueprint for imagination. Take something as simple as the Pokédex entries from the earliest games. Many of them were far more mysterious, almost eerie, than later generations. Those early entries didn't worry about scientific accuracy. They felt like rumors, myths, or fragments of folklore passed down by travelers. They gave Pokemon a sense of ancient history that later regions expanded upon. Even something as common as Rattata was described with surprising intensity, noting how it could live anywhere, gnaw through anything, and multiply at a pace that made it practically inevitable. It set the tone. Even the smallest Kanto Pokemon had survival instincts honed by long-forgotten cycles of the wild. Kanto's ghost types carried the strongest sense of that early mystery. Back when the Pokemon Tower was first introduced, it wasn't just a battle area, it was one of the most atmospheric locations in the entire series. Lavender Town's music played softly in the background, creating a feeling of isolation and reverence. Ghastly's early lore suggested an entity made almost entirely of poisonous gas, capable of drifting through walls like a living fog. Haunter's entries hinted at a mischievous but dangerous temperament, the kind that flickered between friendliness and something darker, and Gengar, the final shadow, felt like the embodiment of everything unknown about the night. Those early ghost Pokemon made Kanto feel like a world where the living and the supernatural shared space without fully understanding one another. Even Pokemon that weren't explicitly mysterious had elements that hinted at deeper lore. Look at the line of Abra, Kadabra, and Alakazam. Their entries mentioned psychic power so intense that even newborn Abra could teleport away at the slightest hint of fear, falling asleep mid-action out of sheer exhaustion. Kadabra's lore was one of the first to introduce the idea of reality-bending psychic energy, and Alakazam's extraordinary intelligence, said to rival supercomputers, even decades before modern Pokemon regions introduced high-tech devices, felt like a peek into a realm of mental power humans in that world could never truly grasp. Kanto treated psychic abilities almost like a cosmic force, unpredictable and incomprehensible. The early designs also told stories without words. So many Kanto Pokemon have shapes and silhouettes rooted in real-world animals, but simplified and stylized in a way that felt mythic. Arcanine looked like a guardian spirit from ancient folklore, with its mane flowing like painted brushstrokes. Ninetales resembled a mythical creature with 1,000 years of wisdom behind its eyes, each tail supposedly holding a different mystical ability. Even Pokemon that were small or playful had touches of that artistic style. Clefairy's gentle expression and rounded form hinted at an otherworldly origin long before games explicitly connected it to celestial themes. The earliest games also introduced something that became a long-standing thread: Kanto Pokemon tied to humanity's ancient past. Kabuto and Kabutops, revived from fossils, still retained habits from prehistoric oceans, showing how evolution shaped their bodies for survival in deep waters where sunlight never reached. Aerodactyl felt like the perfect blend of danger and majesty, described as a fossil Pokémon revived through incomplete technology, suggesting that the creature the player sees may still differ from what once soared through ancient skies. These fossils reminded players that Kanto's world extended far beyond the present, rooted in eons of history filled with creatures long vanished. Another fascinating detail from early Kanto design is how many Pokémon show traces of environmental adaptation. Take Weezing, whose body shape changed depending on the toxicity of the air around it, or Grimer and Muck, which became more dangerous when exposed to industrial pollution. These weren't just creatures, they were reflections of the world they inhabited, shaped by urbanization and human impact. Even Magnemite and Magneton felt like they existed somewhere between nature and machine, representing a theme of technological evolution mirrored in later regions. Water-type Pokémon in Gen 1 carried some of the most elegant designs in the entire franchise. Lapras, with its calm expression and gentle nature, felt ancient, intelligent, and almost regal. Early Pokédex entries described it as nearly extinct due to overhunting, adding a layer of melancholy to its beauty. Dugong and Seal gave the icy waters personality, moving across frozen seas with grace. Even the classic Magikarp to Gyarados evolution felt like a mythological transformation, the weak becoming powerful, the harmless turning into something capable of changing the tide of a battle. There's a reason that storyline stayed so iconic. It represented the emotional arc of the journey itself. Some Gen 1 facts are still surprising today. Kangaskhan remains one of the only Pokémon designed from the beginning to be shown with a child as part of its body. That design choice created decades of theories, some suggesting evolutionary connections to other Pokémon, others hinting that the baby might be a completely unique species. Meanwhile, Hitmonlee and Hitmonchan were early examples of Pokémon inspired directly by martial arts, each with exaggerated abilities that bordered on superhuman. Hitmonlee's legs stretched like springs, while Hitmonchan's punches were so fast they were said to leave scorched air behind them. These early ideas blended realism and fantasy seamlessly, giving Kanto its signature charm. Even the regional wildlife had surprising depth. Farfetch'd, which at first seemed like a simple bird carrying a leek, had backstory involving its species being nearly hunted to extinction because humans used both the Pokémon and its vegetable companion for cooking. That comedic but serious detail added a layer of world building that made the region feel authentic. Doduo and Dodrio, with their multiple heads, suggested evolutionary quirks that blurred the line between biology and cartoon exaggeration. And Pidgeot, one of the earliest fully evolved birds, was described as capable of flying faster than sound, a claim that later generations softened but never fully contradicted, leaving a mythic air around the species. The early Kanto dungeons also shaped how Pokémon were interpreted. The rock tunnel, dimly lit and filled with bats whose echolocation filled the air, painted an ecosystem where Zubat and Geodude dominated. The Seafoam Islands created a frigid network of caverns where Seal and Shelder clung to icy surfaces in complete comfort. Victory Road introduced the idea that powerful Pokémon lived near places of challenge, as if drawn by the intensity of trainers training for the Pokémon League. In those caves, Machoke trained in solitude, Onyx rested in the earth, and even rare creatures like Moltres appeared at the peak of pressure, symbolizing strength in adversity. Kanto's legendary birds were some of the earliest examples of natural elemental guardians. Articuno represented winter itself, capable of calming blizzards with its wings. Zapdos embodied storms, its presence causing crackling energy to cascade through the air. Moltres, the embodiment of summer heat and rebirth, spread flames so intense they were said to leave trails of sparks in open sky. These three Pokemon created the first elemental trio, a concept later repeated in countless forms, and despite their simplicity, they remain some of the most visually iconic Pokemon ever designed. The designs of many Kanto Pokemon also drew from cultural influences that were subtle enough to feel natural even to players who never noticed them. Persian's elegance mirrored classical depictions of noble cats in Eastern art. Golduck resembled a blend between a river deity and a water creature with psychic undertones. Executor's tropical design mirrored depictions of walking palm trees, which themselves are inspired by myths of wandering flora. Even seemingly silly Pokemon like Wigglytuff or Lickitung had roots in Japanese creature folklore, beings that looked soft, harmless, and almost whimsical, yet carried mysterious abilities. Another fascinating fact is how many Kanto Pokemon were designed with physical exaggerations that subtly suggested their roles. Rhyhorn's heavy, angular plates gave the impression of unstoppable momentum. Pinsir's massive horns felt dangerous enough to reflect its territorial temperament. Scyther's scythes were so sharp that early lore suggested they cut through thick trees without slowing down. These extreme features weren't just stylistic, they conveyed identity, telling players exactly how each Pokemon lived. Kanto also excelled at giving everyday creatures personality. Butterfree, with its large, expressive eyes and gentle nature, became synonymous with companionship. Early watchers of the anime remember the emotional farewell scenes that cemented Butterfree's reputation as one of the most iconic bugs in the series. Meanwhile, Beedrill's aggressive design showed how dangerous the wilderness could be when approached without caution. Pidgeot ruled the skies with grace. Fearow ruled them with intimidation. Even the simplest bird or bug held a distinct role within Kanto's natural hierarchy. Perhaps the most enduring aspect of Kanto is how its Pokemon blend nostalgia with timeless charm. No matter how many generations come after, these early designs remain central to the identity of the franchise. They're creatures that feel both mythical and familiar, powerful yet approachable. They've starred in the earliest stories, carried players through countless adventures, and inspired decades of new ideas. Every fact about them, whether eerie or funny or grand, reflects a region that shaped the entire world of Pokémon. And somewhere in that pixelated memory of tall grass, caves, and gentle chimes from an old Game Boy speaker, those original creatures still roam, timeless, iconic, and forever at the heart of the Pokémon journey. There is something endlessly charming about the earliest era of Pokémon, a sense that the world was still discovering itself at the same time the player was discovering it. Every creature in the Kanto region carried a kind of raw mystery, a presence that felt both simple and strangely deep. Even the most ordinary Pokémon seemed to have secrets tucked just beneath their designs, small hints of ecological roles, hidden behaviors, or abandoned concepts. Those early days of the franchise were filled with creative experimentation, and that energy lingers in every Gen 1 design, giving the region a nostalgic weight unlike anything that came after. It's as if the entire world is suspended in a quiet moment before everything expanded into the sprawling multiverse fans know today. Much of that atmosphere comes from how the Kanto Pokémon inhabit their environments. Before later regions introduced elaborate backstories and interconnected ecosystems, Kanto relied on its simplicity. Rattata scurried through fields and city edges, as if it belonged in both places equally. Pidgey drifted lazily through forests, their gentle feathers catching the soft breeze. Even Caterpie and Weedle seemed perfectly placed along routes that doubled as a child's first encounter with the natural world. Every common Pokémon felt approachable, a subtle invitation for players to explore further without fear. This closeness between player and creature helped build a bond that continues to define the franchise decades later. Some of the most interesting Gen 1 facts come from observing how their designs reflect the era's hand-drawn creativity. Many Kanto Pokémon have silhouettes that remain unmistakable even as the series evolves into more detailed art styles. Pikachu's rounded cheeks, Charizard's sharp wings, Gengar's mischievous grin, these shapes are so deeply embedded in the cultural memory of the franchise that even those unfamiliar with the games can recognize them instantly. It's rare for a set of designs to remain iconic without significant alterations, but Kanto Pokémon did that effortlessly. Their simplicity wasn't a limitation, it was a strength, allowing personalities to shine clearly through every line. The early Pokédex entries added to this sense of wonder. They weren't filled with overly complex lore or heavy symbolism. Instead, they gave short, sometimes cryptic descriptions that made the creatures feel more like wild animals than legendary figures. Take the way the entries talked about Ekans silently stalking prey, or the strangely poetic phrasing describing how Butterfree's wings carried healing powders. These weren't meant to create mythic backstories, they were meant to spark imagination. Players filled in the gaps naturally, and the result was a generation of Pokémon that always felt larger than the text could ever fully explain. Gen 1 also carries an unexpected emotional depth in the way it portrays the bonds between certain Pokémon and their trainers. Consider how loyal Growlithe is described, or how devoted Ninetales is to purity and respect, or how affectionate Clefairy is toward those who treat it kindly. These touches gave the region a sense of warmth that matched its simple landscapes. Even the more intimidating Pokémon, like Nidoking or Arcanine, were portrayed as fiercely protective rather than outright aggressive. It created a world where danger existed, but harmony was always close at hand. Every encounter, wild or trained, felt like a small story. Kanto's Pokémon also carry hints of ancient history, even if it's presented subtly. Fossil Pokémon like Aerodactyl, Omanite, and Kabuto hint at a prehistoric era deep beneath the region's modern routes. Their rocky textures and unusual shapes suggest a world long before humans arrived, adding a layer of mystery to the region without requiring elaborate explanation. Meanwhile, creatures like Alakazam, with an intelligence rumored to surpass human scientists, implied that Pokémon were not simply animals, but beings with cognitive potential far beyond what humans understood. Kanto mythology didn't need entire legends to feel alive. It only needed small glimpses of something greater. One of the most quietly fascinating aspects of Gen 1 Pokémon is how many of them interact with light, sound, or color in interesting ways. Jigglypuff uses its voice to lull opponents to sleep, a behavior that fits perfectly with its round, almost balloon-like appearance. Magnemite manipulates electricity in ways that reflect early science fiction influences. Staryu and Starmie flash their core gems when communicating or distressed, adding a surprisingly emotional layer to creatures that many assumed were purely aquatic. Even Voltorb and Electrode, whose designs mirror Pokeballs, emit sparks of static that suggest a nervous energy hiding beneath their spherical forms. Then, there are the Pokemon whose lore borders on the mysterious. Haunter floats between realms, with a playful yet eerie presence, while Abra slips into sleep as a natural defense. Machop's growth from a small martial arts novice into the towering Machamp hints at training cultures that existed long before the modern league. Dragonair carries weather within its body, creating tranquil rainfall or sudden storms depending on its mood. Each one adds a brushstroke to the evolving landscape of Kanto, a region defined not by grandeur, but by subtle, interconnected moments. Kanto's roots and caves are filled with Pokémon that reflect one another in clever ways. Zubat and Golbat bring motion to dark areas where visibility is low. Geodude, with its rocky exterior, blends into mountain paths naturally, so much so that early players often jumped in surprise when one suddenly appeared. Diglett and Dugtrio create the foundations beneath Kanto's agricultural fields, implying that even the unseen Pokémon of the region are essential to its stability. These ecological relationships, though simple, give the world a sense of realism that players rarely noticed consciously, but always felt intuitively. Even the Pokémon that appear unusual or comedic have meaningful places in the region's design. Psyduck's headaches reveal latent psychic abilities that make it both charming and unexpectedly powerful. Jinx dances rhythmically in ways that evoke certain cultural traditions that were lightly hinted at in early lore. Mr. Mime acts as a bridge between human occupations and Pokémon talent, often assisting in performing arts or household tasks. These quirky touches add warmth and variety to the world, keeping Kanto from ever feeling repetitive. Battles in the Gen 1 era often showcase the raw potential of these iconic creatures. The early stat spreads weren't perfectly balanced, but they created unique personalities in combat. Snorlax's overwhelming bulk made it one of the region's most memorable encounters, lounging across roads and refusing to move without music. Gyarados emerged with terrifying force from its humble beginnings as Magikarp, symbolizing transformation through patience and resilience. Even something as simple as a team of Pidgey or Spearow could feel powerful when raised with care in the early routes, proving that Kanto Pokémon didn't need complexity to shine, they only needed opportunity. The region's starter Pokémon remain some of the most beloved in franchise history. Bulbasaur's gentle demeanor and plant symbiosis gave it a natural connection to Kanto's forests. Charmander's evolution into Charizard represented growth through adversity, especially with the lore surrounding its flame and emotions. Squirtle, the calm and reliable partner, reflected the steadiness that so many players found comforting. Each starter embodied a different emotional journey, and together they formed the foundation of millions of childhood memories. Kanto's legendary Pokémon added mystery rather than scale. The 3 legendary birds soared across the region, each representing an element tied directly to the landscape: ice from the sea cliffs, fire from the volcanic islands, and electricity from the stormy power plants. Mew, delicate and elusive, floated through myths about ancient civilizations and forgotten genetics. Mewtwo, powerful and misunderstood, stood alone at the edge of humanity's ambition. These legendaries didn't need sprawling backstories. Their mere existence carried enough presence to define Kanto's deepest mysteries. What makes Gen 1 so soothing to revisit is how grounded it feels. The world isn't trying to overwhelm the player. It simply exists, inviting exploration, whether wandering through the tall grass of Route 1, listening to the gentle music of Viridian Forest, or watching sunlight flicker through Lavender Tower's stained glass windows. The region has a softness to it, a quiet invitation to slow down, breathe, and enjoy the companionship of the Pokémon who inhabit it. Each fact about these creatures reveals not just world building, but an emotional memory from the early days of the series. And even now, decades later, the spirit of those first 151 remains as comforting as ever. Gentle shapes moving through pixel forests, glowing eyes peering through caves, soft cries echoing across faintly lit routes. Kanto Pokémon continue to feel like old friends, timeless companions walking beside the player through every new region. They never lose their charm because they were designed not to impress, but to resonate, and that resonance still echoes quietly through every game, every memory, and every peaceful night someone falls asleep thinking about the simple beauty of the world where it all began.